Welcome to the WeRPN webinar on cannabis. Information in this presentation is accurate as of October 1st, 2018. Information on cannabis may change. Please check back on the WeRPN and other recommended websites regularly. This webinar will focus on non-medical cannabis, but a brief overview of medical cannabis will also be provided. The following information will be discussed: the background on legalization, legislation, federal and provincial, medical and non-medical cannabis, health effects and reducing harm from cannabis, occupational health and safety concerns, and ethical considerations. A bit of a background. Cannabis and its byproducts are the most widely used illegal psychoactive substances in the world. Canada has one of the highest prevalence rates of cannabis use in the world, with 34% of Canadians having used cannabis as a drug during their lifetimes. The Liberal Party platform in 2016 included a commitment to legalize, regulate, and restrict access to marijuana and remove marijuana consumption and incidental possession from the criminal code and create new, stronger laws to punish more severely those who provide it to minors, those who operate a motor vehicle while under its influence, and those who sell it outside of the new regulatory framework. The Liberal Party of Canada in 2016 policy position indicated that the goals were to reduce the rate at which young people are consuming cannabis, reduce to zero the rate of consumption of cannabis for children, reduce the total number of people with criminal records for cannabis possession offenses, reduce the total of enforcing cannabis laws to all parts of the criminal justice system, and reduce the net profits from the cannabis market to people offending as organized criminals, and divert a portion of cannabis market profits to legitimate taxation. Cannabis is legal as of October 17, 2018. The Cannabis Act creates a strict legal framework across Canada for controlling the production, distribution, sale, and possession of cannabis. There are three goals of the Act: keeping cannabis out of the hands of youth, keeping profits out of the hands of criminals, and protecting public health and safety by allowing adults access to safe, legal cannabis. As of October 17, 2018, subject to provincial or territorial restrictions, adults who are 18 years of age or older are legally able to possess up to 30 grams of legal cannabis, dried or equivalent in non-dried form, in public, share up to 30 grams of legal cannabis with other adults, buy dried or fresh cannabis and cannabis oil from a provincially licensed retailer, grow from licensed seeds or seedlings up to 4 cannabis plants per resident for personal use, and make cannabis products such as food and drinks at home as long as organic solvents are not used to create concentrated products. Some additional measures within the federal legislation include protecting youth. The Cannabis Act has several measures that help prevent youth from accessing cannabis. These include both age restrictions and restricting the promotion of cannabis. No person may sell or provide cannabis to any person under the age of 18. The Act creates 2 new criminal offenses for giving or selling cannabis to youth and/or using a youth to commit a cannabis-related offense. The Cannabis Act helps discourage youth cannabis use by prohibiting products that are appealing to youth, packaging or labeling cannabis in a way that makes it appealing to youth, or selling cannabis through self-service displays. Protecting public health. The Act protects public health through creating strict safety and quality regulations. In addition, public education efforts will raise awareness about safety measures and any potential health risks. Reducing criminal activity. More than half of all drug offenses reported by police are cannabis-related. In allowing the production and possession of legal cannabis for adults, the Act will help keep Canadians who consume cannabis out of the criminal justice system. This will also reduce the burden on the courts. Criminal penalties. Under the Act, newly defined offenses will target those acting outside of the legal framework, such as organized crime. New offenses will also be created specifically targeting people who make cannabis available to youth. Ontario has passed new laws about how, where, and who can buy, possess, and consume cannabis in the province. These rules are similar to those in place for alcohol and tobacco, with some differences. You need to be 19 and older to buy, use, possess, and grow recreational cannabis. This is the same as the minimum age for the sale of tobacco and alcohol in Ontario. You are only able to use recreational cannabis in a private residence, including the outdoor space of a home, for example, a porch or a backyard. A unit on a balcony, if living in a multi-unit building like an apartment or condo, but it does depend on the building's rules or your lease agreement. You are not allowed to use recreational cannabis in any public place, workplaces, motorized vehicles. These will be in place to protect people from secondhand cannabis smoke and reduce youth and young adult exposure to cannabis. It is illegal to drive drug impaired, and it's just as dangerous as driving drunk. Cannabis, like many other drugs, slows your reaction time and increases your chances of being in a collision. Now that it's legal, people 19 and over will be able to purchase cannabis through the Ontario Cannabis Store website. At this time, it's the only legal option for purchasing recreational cannabis online. It follows strict rules set by the federal government. The Ontario government, in addition, has now allowed some private stores, who are regulated, with the protection of youth and children as a top priority. These stores will help the province combat the illegal market. You are able to purchase up to 30 grams, which is about 1 ounce, of dried recreational cannabis for personal use at one time. People are able to have a maximum of 30 grams, again about 1 ounce, of dried cannabis in public at any time. People are now able to grow up to 4 plants per residence. This is not per person. People are also able to purchase legal seeds and seedlings from the Ontario Cannabis Store website. Occupational health and safety at Ontario workplaces. The Occupational Health and Safety Act sets out the rights and duties of workplace parties and describes ways of dealing with workplace hazards. Employers and supervisors are required to know the rules for medical cannabis and are also required to address any workplace hazards. Workers performing work when they are unable or unfit to do so safely may introduce a hazard to the workplace, to themselves, or to others. Workers have a duty to report any hazards to their employer or supervisor. Hazards may arise from a worker's impairment due to the use of various substances such as alcohol, prescription and non-prescription medication, medical and non-medical cannabis. Employers should examine the possible workplace hazards posed by impairment arising from substance use, including cannabis. In response to the legislation, Ontario has developed a framework for recreational cannabis, which includes ensuring the continued protection of worker health and safety in the province's workplaces. The consumption of recreational cannabis will not be allowed in workplaces, public places, or in motor vehicles. Cannabis for medical purposes is legally accessed through the Access to Cannabis for Medical Purposes regulations. Authorization for access is provided by healthcare practitioners through a medical document. Cannabinoids are chemicals found in the cannabis plant. They can be natural or synthetic and are delivered in controlled doses such as capsules and oral sprays. Cannabis can be effective for relief of nausea, vomiting, certain types of pain, and stimulation of appetite. Research does not indicate that cannabis is always the most appropriate drug to be used for these purposes. There is minimal research about the risks associated with medical use of cannabis. However, reduced cognitive functioning and respiratory ailments are associated with chronic use. The Access to Cannabis for Medical Purposes regulations, abbreviated as ACMPR, under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, allows for authorized individuals to possess marijuana for medical purposes. The same regulations allow others, including nurses, to possess the marijuana for the sake of assisting the authorized individual in taking the medical marijuana. For nurses who practice in a hospital setting only, there is an exemption. Section 56 class exemption to authorize the conduct of activities with cannabis in hospitals under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act that authorizes certain hospital employees, including nurses, to directly administer medical marijuana to clients as opposed to assisting. When administering any medication to clients, nurses are accountable for adhering to the college's medication practice standards. Nurses must ensure that they're able to administer the medication safely, competently, and manage the potential outcomes of administering. Nurses must consider whether they have the knowledge, skill, and judgment and the authority required to assist a client with taking medical marijuana. For example, an order may be required in some practice settings. Current research indicates that much of the health-related harms of non-medical cannabis use fall into the following categories: respiratory effects, cannabis use disorder, mental health issues, cannabis and driving, and accidental overdose. Respiratory effects. Substantial evidence shows an association between cannabis smoking and respiratory symptoms, which include coughing, wheezing, shortness of breath on exertion, and episodes of chronic bronchitis. The DSM-5, Manual of Mental Disorders, defines cannabis use disorder as a problematic pattern of cannabis use leading to clinically significant impairment or distress. About 9% of cannabis users develop this type of dependence. Long-term, frequent users have a higher risk of dependence than occasional users. Research has identified links between cannabis use and mental health issues. While additional data is needed, some evidence links chronic cannabis use with depression, anxiety, and suicidal behaviors. Cannabis impairs psychomotor, cognitive, and memory performance, which can impair driving and significantly increases the risk of a motor vehicle crash. A lesser known but important harm of non-medical cannabis use is the increased risk of unintentional overdose injuries. These injuries arise most often after the ingestion of cannabis-infused foods, also known as edibles, which come in many forms, including candies and baked goods such as cookies or brownies. Despite the need for additional research, there is a general agreement from the existing evidence and expert consensus that potential adverse health effects are concentrated among a limited group of high-risk or vulnerable populations. These would be youth, pregnant women, and persons with a personal or family history of psychosis. Youth research indicates that because the brain is still developing until around age 25, the initiation of cannabis use prior to this age can alter brain structures or areas including those responsible for memory, cognition, and executive functioning. Chronic use of cannabis also appears to have different effects on youth than on adults. While significant, lasting problems with cognition, memory, and attention can occur with frequent cannabis use among the youth. The same response does not appear to be in the case for the adults. When adults discontinue chronic use, such cognitive deficits can sometimes be reversed. The same may not be true for youths who begin using in an earlier adolescence period. Regular cannabis use during pregnancy has been linked to low birth weight and has also been shown to affect children's cognitive functioning, behavior, and mental health. The relationship between cannabis use and psychosis is much more likely in cannabis users with a pre-existing genetic risk or a personal or family history of psychotic symptoms. There are recommendations to reduce harm from non-medical cannabis. They include 1. Delaying use until early adulthood. Since the risk of dependence is higher when use begins at an earlier age, cannabis use disorder and its related health harms may be reduced or avoided if use is delayed until early adulthood. 2. Minimizing frequency of use. Because the risk of harm increases with the rate of use, avoid frequent daily or near daily use. 3. Trying to stop when use becomes hard to control. Frequent users of non-medical cannabis who experience difficulty controlling their use should attempt to stop with professional help as necessary. 4. Minimizing respiratory complications. To reduce respiratory complications, avoid smoking cannabis with tobacco, refrain from deep inhalation and breath holding, and consider using a vaporizer rather than smoking. 5. Avoiding using amounts that are large or highly concentrated. Be wary of excessive use or high-potency THC cannabis, including synthetic cannabinoid products. Consider adjusting the dose by using only the amount needed to achieve the desired effect. 6. Refraining from using non-medical cannabis with alcohol. Mixing non-medical cannabis with alcohol can increase impairment exponentially and can also cause anxiety, nausea, vomiting, or fainting. 7. Not driving while high. And don't get in a vehicle if the driver's high. Given that the effect of cannabis consumed by inhalation typically peaks after 30 minutes and gradually subsides after 1 to 3.5 hours, although cognitive impairment may actually last up to 6 hours, people should not drive for at least 6 hours after use by inhalation and longer if used by ingestion. Wait longer if high-potency products or larger doses were used, if acute impairment persists, or if the cannabis was used with other substances, including alcohol. 8. Sharing with care. Users should take care to minimize lip contact with joints or implements for smoking or vaporization. Shared items that come in contact with the lips increase the risk of transmitting infections, including meningitis, influenza, and other pathogens. 9. Abstaining from use if from a vulnerable group. An increased risk for cannabis-related problems can occur in high-risk groups, including pregnant women and individuals with a personality or familiar history of psychosis. These groups should avoid use altogether. And 10, using caution when ingesting cannabis. To avoid accidental overdose with cannabis edibles, the quote is start low and go slow. It's recommended to start with no more than 10 milligrams of THC and wait at least 2 hours before ingesting any more. To avoid accidental overdoses with children or pets, store edibles and other cannabis products safely and out of reach. Cannabis is available in several forms: dried, fresh cannabis, and cannabis oils. There are several routes for administration of cannabis. Smoked or vaporized cannabis, which has a 5-minute onset with a 2 to 4 hour duration. Oral or buccal, which includes tinctures, edibles, and sublingual spray, which has a 30 to 60-minute onset and a duration of 8 to 12 hours. Topical cannabis, which comes in balms, lotions, and salves, this route is not fully understood in relation to onset and duration yet. The College of Nurses of Ontario has identified the following values as being most important in providing nursing care in Ontario: client well-being, client choice, privacy and confidentiality, respect for life, maintaining commitments, truthfulness, and fairness. When values differ, consideration of clients' wishes may be difficult when their beliefs and values differ from those of nurses. Nurses have their own personal values and may experience an ethical conflict when they disagree with the client's decisions. Use of cannabis by a client could be an ethical conflict for some nurses. Nurses may believe that, as healthcare professionals, they know what is best for their clients. However, clients have the rights to choose a risky course of action. From the standpoint of ethical nursing practice, the nurse also has a role to facilitate the client's actions and choices, including providing assistance to clients who cannot take their own medical marijuana independently. For additional information, please access the following resources: Canada's Lower Risk Cannabis Use Guidelines. These are science-based recommendations to enable people to reduce their health risks associated with cannabis use. Cannabis health effects. Cannabis experts answer questions about cannabis health effects. Cannabis in Canada. Implications for nursing in a changing legal and healthcare landscape. This is a webinar available through YouTube. And harm reduction for non-medical cannabis use. This is a CNA discussion paper. Thank you for listening to the WeRPN Cannabis webinar.